1942. This would then mark the first appearance of Theodore Adorno in this class, which is important. Adorno is oftentimes regarded as maybe the most brilliant of all the Frankfurt School theorists. So it'll be interesting to really go into his writing a little bit more. Again, this is sort of a co-authored book between Horkheimer and Adorno, so it's not always clear who's writing who, or whose idea is which. But we will also look at some of Adorno's other writings later on in the class. So there's definitely a relationship between these things. Benjamin's take on history from the book written by Horkheimer and Adorno. In many ways, Horkheimer and Adorno are kind of refining a lot of the ideas that Benjamin is talking about here, or Benjamin. I always tend to slip and call him Benjamin, but I think either way of saying it is fine, actually. But Adorno is what was very much influenced by Benjamin. He was a little bit younger. He's a little bit younger than Horkheimer and Benjamin, and sort of, I guess you could say, sort of looked up to Benjamin early on. In many ways, for many years at least, people kind of, I think, even looked at Benjamin as somebody who was sort of eclipsed by Adorno, or was known only to the extent to which he kind of served as an influence on Adorno's thinking. But I think nowadays people tend to regard or look at Benjamin much more as a thinker in his own right. So there is definitely a kind of smooth transition, I think, between looking at this and then looking at the writings of Horkheimer and Adorno, which we'll start, I guess, probably next class. Now, we're also, if you look at the syllabus, we're also looking at that book for 2 weeks. So that is written on the syllabus. So that'll continue on into next week. March 7th is considered a review period for the midterm, which will be on the 10th. So I might even sort of overlap with that a little bit. I might even sort of extend the Horkheimer Adorno reading up until then. But if you haven't already, start reading the Horkheimer Adorno book. You don't have to read the whole thing. Again, the syllabus sort of breaks down which chapters we'll be going over in the class. The assignment is already up there on Canvas. So anyway, so without any further ado, let's try to get through this Benjamin reading. So I didn't actually add a lot more slides. I have the PowerPoint open here. I didn't really add much to it, only a couple more slides, 3 actually. 2 of them are images, actually. I'd like to try to actually go through the text itself. It's a fairly short text. It's 20 paragraphs long, basically, and they're kind of spaced apart. It's a fairly quick read, although the meaning of it is fairly dense and it is somewhat ambiguous. So I think going through it fairly closely will probably be beneficial in trying to understand what it means. So I didn't add much to the PowerPoint here. I'll probably look at this real quick and then basically switch over to the text, which I have open here as a PDF file. Benjamin's, this is basically, the last thing that Benjamin wrote before he died, which I already mentioned. Sadly committed suicide, trying to escape from the Nazis, believed he was going to be captured by them, and basically chose death rather than being captured. Tragically, a very familiar story that you hear from many people during this period of time. This is certainly not Benjamin's certainly not the only person to do something like that. So it's a very pessimistic work. I mean, there's just no other way of getting around it. I mean, this was a text written by somebody who literally committed suicide less than a year after this text was written, and in fact within the same year. It was written early 1940. Benjamin dies in September 1940. 1940 is also probably if you could pick a year, probably the darkest year of the whole war, in a certain regard at least. I mean, at this point in time, the Nazis were running through Europe, of course, culminating in the fall of France in 1940, in the summer of 1940. The Soviet Union and Germany were allied at this point. Not that the Soviet Union was participating in the war, but that the Soviet Union was not fighting the Germans at that point. That would end actually the very next year when Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union. Probably the worst decision made by Hitler during the war. Probably changed the outcome of the war. In fact, had he not done that, things could have gone very differently. In fact, but yeah, I mean that kind of pessimistic feel kind of pervades the entire text. It's also, like I said, very it's very ambiguous. It's open to multiple interpretations. Many people see this, in fact, as Benjamin's sort of break with Marxist thinking, or what is known as historical materialism. I don't think that's really supported by a reading of the text, but I guess when you're as ambiguous as this, you're open to all sorts of interpretations like that. Anyway, so there are several themes that kind of run throughout. And again, this is a very sort of fragmentary writing. Had Benjamin lived longer, who knows, maybe he would have had time to revise this more, if not rewrite this, at least obviously develop these ideas further in future writings. But this is, again, essentially the text that we have. So one of the major themes is the theme of historical materialism versus historicism. And, again, at first glance, they might sound similar. They're both sort of, approaches to history, basically. Historical materialism, if you don't know, of course, is essentially the sort of Marxist theory or the Marxist method. This is, in fact, what Marx and Engels refer to their, theoretical approach as. They always, refer to it as historical materialism. They did not call themselves, Marxist, obviously. And of course, that is a view which, again, emphasizes the notion of class conflict at the center of history, which looks at the development of economic forces, the so-called relations and forces of production, and as sort of like the animating forces that sort of drive historical change, the so-called engine of history. Historicism is much more, I guess another way you could think of it as basically mainstream history, sort of a more mainstream historical approach, which stresses a kind of more relativist way of looking at history. In other words, you look at each historical period in its own right. Right. Benjamin even refers later on to a writer who suggests basically looking at each historical period and basically sort of like forgetting the future course of history, to just look at the historical period in its own right, which Benjamin regards as both impossible, obviously, and even if you could, probably not something that you should do. And I think there are good reasons for that. So this kind of relativist way of looking at history, you sort of judge things by their own historical standards, is something which Benjamin seems to be against. And I think the reason for that is that that kind of relativist, there are at least three major themes, I think, that stand out about this historicist way of looking at things, all of which are kind of related to each other. This kind of relativistic way of looking at things leads to a view of history that looks at historical periods, that looks at the historical past in a very kind of isolated way, in a very kind of disconnected way. And that seems to be, more than anything else, what Benjamin seems to be arguing against. He does not think that you should look at history, he does not think that you should look at the historical past as something that we are detached from or disconnected from. That is still very much something that resonates in the very present. And of course, what is the common underlying theme of that? It would be, again, this struggle against oppression would seem to be the sort of unifying theme that animates all of history, basically, that animates past and the present. This historical struggle against oppression, particularly in through the lens of the idea of class struggle. Whereas like I said, the more mainstream historian approach is to look at the past as a distant thing. You're aware of the past, you're aware of things that happened in the past. You tend to stress more, dates, and there's even almost like, again, a kind of almost quantitative approach to the past, in that you make everything about numbers, you make everything about specific dates and things like that. Um, whereas, Benjamin's more about, what are sort of the common threads that people in the present day share with people in the past. And of course, this is one way in which we ourselves, people speaking, now contemporary, how we ourselves can really sort of approach, the Benjamin essay, that the struggles that he was dealing with and people like him were dealing with back then are still very much struggles that are still very much issues that we can deal with today. And so out of this sort of isolated view of the past, that this sort of disconnected, detached view of the past, comes another idea which Benjamin argues against, right? And it's this notion of progress, the idea that things are getting better, that we are making progress throughout history, that the past is often looked upon as, dark times, basically, bad times. And thank God, things aren't like that anymore. Thank God we're better off today. And this is very much an important idea that underlies a lot of liberal history, right? This idea that the things are getting better. Benjamin simply argues against that. And, again, it's important to keep in mind that, the context of this guy writing in 1940, a Jew living in Paris at the time, he's already fled Germany. He'll soon be fleeing, France. Tell him that, things are getting better, right? It certainly would have been hard to convince a lot of people living during that period of time that things were actually getting better. Now, again, looking after the war, can we say that now? I mean, I don't know. I think there's a lot of reasons why you could argue that things haven't gotten that much better, and that I think along with that, I think comes a view that people often, it's kind of a hard idea to articulate, but people almost seem to have a kind of sense of superiority almost towards people in the past. I don't know. Again, like I said, it's a hard idea to articulate. It'd be interesting to see what people's own takes on that, what their own insights are and things like that. But we all seem to almost, like, people in the present day almost seem to look down upon people in the past, almost as if we're more sophisticated than they are, we're more advanced than they are. Forgot to do this with the slideshow. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's really a sense of superiority or entitlement that we really deserve to have. I mean, I don't know if we can really maintain that view. But it does seem to be a view that people seem to have, that we're so much better off now than we were in the past. Anyway, Benjamin seems to pretty much argue against all these ideas, whether it's looking at history in a kind of relativistic way, that you can't bring the present day standards back into the past, that history is not an isolated thing, that even our very experience of time, he seems to radically question that idea, right? This idea that we catalog and keep track of days, weeks, months, years. He seems to even suggest at certain places that itself might be sort of an artificial structure that's essentially imposed upon things, and there might be good reason to think that as well. So we're not disconnected from the past, and he's very critical of the idea that we're making progress throughout history as well. So as we go through the text, there are sort of several interesting concepts that Benjamin introduces. He speaks several times about a Messiah, or about a notion of what he calls messianic time, which is an interesting idea. Of course, Benjamin being Jewish, and some people see this as an attempt to sort of reconcile, his sort of Marxist theory with religion, with particularly Judaism. Some people, like Gershom Scholem, who's actually quoted in this text and was sort of a lifelong friend of Benjamin, actually sees this as Benjamin's moment where he, again, essentially leaves behind Marxism and sort of embraces religion. Scholem was a very religious thinker himself, so I mean that's sort of the perspective in which he's coming from. Scholem is an interesting thinker. I don't know that much about him per se. I know he's one of the pretty much the first person to really do a kind of academic study of the Kabbalah, which is this sort of Jewish mystical text. I don't know if anyone's has ever heard of it or is familiar with it at all. Again, I'm not very familiar with it at all. The first time I ever heard of it actually was, I remember years ago hearing that Madonna was like getting into the Kabbalah or something like that. And I think for a while it was kind of associated with these kind of, wacky celebrity, fads that they get into and things like that. There's definitely something to it. The writer Alan Moore, who's one of my favorite science fiction writers, talks about the Kabbalah a lot. And again, Sholem wrote like pretty much the first real sort of, academic, study of it, and was a professor of Jewish mysticism, which is an interesting job title, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Sholem was very, very, very much a Zionist, a believer in the idea of a Jewish homeland, a believer in the state of Israel. Was very critical of Jewish people who would criticize Israel, like Hannah Arendt, for example. So he definitely has his own, perspective, which is coming through here. I don't know if that reading can, if this idea that Benjamin is leaving behind Marxism is really supported by the text, but this is part of the reason why I want to go through the text. One more note on Hannah Arendt. So this book is actually a collection of essays. You do have access to the entire text, so they'll obviously only assign a couple of the readings. But the book is known as Illuminations, and it's basically the first collection of Benjamin's essays, at least published in English. It was published in 1968. I've already mentioned a couple times that there's a tremendous lag, sort of delay in the reception of these ideas, particularly in the English speaking world, usually sometimes of 30 to 40 years in some cases, which in a sense kind of shows you, I mean, I would say 1968 is fairly recent. You might think that's ancient history, but to me, that's fairly recent for these ideas to really be received, again, in the English speaking world, and probably only, slightly, before that in Germany. For people to really, have time to, sort of absorb these ideas and debate them and derive whatever insight they're going to get at them. So I would say these writings are very recent in many regards, at least, relative to, Plato and Aristotle, who people still obviously talk and debate about to this very day. But anyway, so I mentioned Hannah Arendt. So she actually writes the introduction to the book, and if you have time, it's worth checking out. Hannah Arendt was also a very influential political thinker of the 20th century. So if you have time, checking out her essay to open the book is worthwhile as well as the other Benjamin essays, and this is not obviously the only collection of Benjamin's writings as well. But anyway, so this messianic notion, pops up from time to time throughout these readings. He also, at several places, refers to blasting open or blasting the continuum of history, which I think is a fairly profound phrase. And we'll try to explore more of what he says, but I think I've already sort of alluded to it, which is this idea that, the past is still very much relevant, right? It's not something that is just this sort of, archaic, relic that we study that we're completely detached from or disconnected from. Benjamin, regards the past as something very much relevant, particularly again, because what we all sort of share in is this sort of common struggle against oppression. And I think it also, raises another interesting idea, which is that people who turn towards the past, which is what Benjamin does not necessarily make you a conservative thinker or a conservative person. I think that there's this tendency to think that conservatives are people who look towards the past more than the future, or tend to emphasize the past more. That may be true in lots of circumstances, but I don't think it's true necessarily in all circumstances. I think you can oftentimes look to the past and take a sort of more radical view, or sort of bring out try to bring out or blast open, as he says, the radical moments that have happened in the past. After all, I mean, there are plenty of moments in history that were probably much more revolutionary than our own. I mean, again, just because we're living in the present, besides the fact that we'll obviously one day be superseded by people in the future, provided of course there's still human life on this planet in the near future. You can't take anything for granted, but hopefully so. We'll be superseded by that. I mean, when you look at the period of time that we live in now, I think it is a very conservative period of time. We shouldn't just assume that because we're in the present that somehow by default we represent the most sort of progressive moment in human history. There are moments from the past that were probably more progressive or more revolutionary, or people were trying to push things forward more than we are now. I do happen to feel that we do live in a very conservative period of time, the last several 30, 40 years at least. And I do feel that when people look back upon this period of time, that will be sort of the defining characteristic in many ways to the period of time that we live in now. So again, looking to the past doesn't necessarily make you a conservative person, right? It depends what you're looking for, I suppose, and what sort of meaning that you're drawing from that. And that's really what the term philosophy of history means, right? A philosophy of history is sort of asking, what is the significance of history? What is the meaning of history? In other words, it's not just about recording dates. On this day, at this time, so and so did such a thing. That sort of factual reporting of data is not necessarily, or is not the most important thing, or is not really what Benjamin is about. It's more about what is the significance of history, what is the underlying meaning of history that is revealed to us through the study of history. Anyway, so before going into the text itself, a couple of famous quotes from writers who I think express a kind of similar view towards to Benjamin. James Joyce, who said, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to wake." What do you think he means by that? History is a nightmare from which I am trying to wake. Doesn't sound like a very positive view of history. But again, as it relates to Benjamin, I think he's basically saying the same thing, that if you look at history, it's pretty horrible. I mean, most of history is pretty horrible. It's a long history of oppression. It's a long history of the powerful dominating the weak, the haves dominating the have-nots, and there are very brief moments, fleeting moments where that is not the case. But the dominant trend throughout history is that. And so Joyce likens it to a nightmare, which is interesting because anyone who's ever experienced a nightmare knows that it's something that it's like you feel like you're stuck in it, like that you can't get out of it. And I think that sentiment is conveyed there. It's like we're sort of stuck in this nightmare of history, and it's like we can't get ourselves out of it. We can't wake up from it. Yes, Chaim, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was gonna say that I think either Hegel or Marx, they talk about like an end of history. I think in the Hegelian dialect, there's like an end of history, right?
Yeah.
So that might be like what he's talking about, like waking up from the nightmare.
Right.
And then.
This idea of the end of history would be, yes, kind of like waking up from the nightmare. So, the quote from Joy, it's spoken by a character. It's spoken by a character named Stephen Daedalus. But when a writer says something through one of his characters, usually attribute the quote to the writer. But the name Daedalus is interesting because, or Daedalus is in Greek mythology the architect of the labyrinth, which is this vast maze in which people were basically thrown into to be killed by the Minotaur, this kind of bull man from history. Obviously, like I said, this is taken from mythology, but it's interesting to think of the labyrinth, the sort of vast, complex maze of all these branching paths, and you don't really know where you're going. To think of history itself as a labyrinth, that the labyrinth is a metaphor for history that again has all these various paths that you can go to. You know, you study different historical periods, and you can very easily get lost in the, you know, minutia of details and things like that, and all the complex events that have, you know, unfolded over time. I mean, if that's true, if you can look at it as a metaphor, then I guess you would also add that it's a labyrinth that's expanding, right? The maze-like structure of it is constantly expanding as well. It's not even like a static structure. And sort of learning your way through the labyrinth is like kind of like working your way through the nightmare of history. You know, the idea that if you make it out of the labyrinth, that's you know, equivalent to waking up from the nightmare of history. Very few people have really ever been able to do that. I first heard about this, ironically enough, in a documentary about the movie The Shining by Stanley Kubrick. Not the James Joyce prose, but the connection between Daedalus and the labyrinth. Because, well, if you've ever seen the movie, it has a very famous scene at the end where you know, the main character, Danny, is fleeing in a maze, you know, in a labyrinth. And he's also fleeing from, you know, the bull man, you know, his father, who's gone crazy at this point. The bull man then represents sort of like the primitive, you know, brutish aspects of humanity, you know, specifically men, basically. And it's this idea of, you know, Kubrick was, of course, very much, you know, concerned with history, World War II, you know, lived through World War II, you know, as a younger person, but as a Jewish person, of course, you know, like anyone would have, you know, been very concerned with what went on here. So this idea of again trying to sort of learn from the past to sort of, you know, trace your steps through the labyrinth of history, I think is an interesting metaphor. So that's one way of thinking of it. The other quote is by William Faulkner, right, who says the past is never dead. It's not even past. What does he mean by that? It's not even past. Well, I think, again, it sort of speaks to Benjamin's idea that we are not detached from, or we are not disconnected from history. In contrast to the kind of mainstream historical approach, which does teach that view, which does encourage people or sort of condition people to think, you know, to think that way. Interesting enough, you know, James Joyce and Faulkner are both what are considered, you know, modernist writers, you know, as distinct from the earlier realist writers of the 19th century. And one of the sort of the hallmarks of modernist writing is sort of subverting the sort of conventional experience of time through various techniques like stream of consciousness writing, non-linear storytelling. So events sort of jump out of sequence and things like that. It's interesting because that seems to, you know, match up again with what, you know, Benjamin is talking about here, who's also opposed to a kind of linear view of history. The idea that things start out in this, you know, brutal, primitive past, and they gradually get better and better as we go throughout history. That would be considered then a linear view, and Benjamin is opposed to that. And it seems as if, you know, Joyce and Faulkner are as well. So, you know, again, before we start going into the text, I've already wasted a half an hour already before we even moved into that. But let's talk briefly about some historical moments which this could be applied to, as well as, you know, present day moments, or try to, you know, illustrate this with talking about, you know, more recent events as well. But when we look at moments like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, World War II, the Gilded Age, I think there's very, you know, I think it's safe to say that most people have already been conditioned to think this way, that we may be aware of things, we may be aware of certain things that happen on certain dates and things like that. And even that, frankly, you can't take for granted anymore because people don't really learn a lot about history in schools anymore. You know, speaking of a quantitative approach to things, I mean, look at, you know, just look at how the American education system is, right? Where everything is about STEM, everything is about test scores and things like that. So, you know, what gets sacrificed is a more sort of qualitative approach to knowledge, history, you know, philosophy, literature, and things like that. That being said, you know, even in the American approach to things, and like I've said, you know, before, I mean, the sort of quantitative emphasis on everything seems to be more prevalent in the United States than it does even in a lot of other countries. But this sort of quantitative approach to everything even sort of bleeds into things like history and literature, and and we try to quantify everything and reduce everything to formulas and things like that. Um, so like I said, I think most people are already conditioned to viewing these events as well as obviously others in this sort of detached way, right? That we think of the French Revolution as something that happened a very long time ago and has very little, even if you understand its historical significance, you don't really see it as something that is still relevant to this day. That what people were going through literally back then is something that people are still essentially going through today, or during the Russian Revolution, or during World War II, which of course was a struggle against fascism. And that is at least one contemporary example I think that has come up a lot lately, is to what extent can you speak of contemporary day America using the F word? And by the F word, I mean fascism, of course, the other F word. Is it appropriate? Is it appropriate to talk about fascism here in the United States? Again, a lot of people would say no. And I think that speaks to this view of history that Benjamin is fighting against, right? This idea that, oh, well, fascism, that was something that happened a long time ago. We got rid of that. We've, again, progressed beyond that. We're better off. That's something from the past. We don't have to worry about that anymore. But is that true? Is fascism really something that you don't have to worry about anymore? Or is it something that continues to, play a role in today's society? And that fascism itself is really just sort of one historical moment of a much greater, again, sort of constant struggle against oppression. So, I've heard it, come up a lot. I know some people don't think that's appropriate to compare Trump to, to Hitler and things like that, or to other, wannabe fascist leaders, to speak about, that the January 6th Capitol riot was an attempted, fascist coup against the United States government. I'm not as optimistic as other people. I think it is appropriate, to talk about fascism. I think, yeah, we certainly can talk about those things. I don't think we should just, conveniently and very complacently consider those things to be something from the past, something that's not relevant anymore. Your mileage may vary, but that's what I think, at least. The Gilded Age is another fascinating era, right? Because it seems like this is something that people don't talk about a lot anymore either, right? This period of time, basically after, roughly after the Civil War to basically right up until the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, if you found a middle of the road sort of moderate American history textbook, or not even like a school textbook, but just a book on American history that was written from very like middle of the road point of view from the 1950s, let's say, or the 1960s, they're very explicit about certain things about that era of time. One, of course, is that what they even call, the robber barons, these sort of, the big businessmen of this era were completely ruthless, were completely brutal, with, think nothing of, crushing, strikes against their workers with massive amounts of force. They thought nothing of, bribing politicians and things like that. That the politicians themselves are from this era were seen as, pathetically, corrupt and subservient to, business interest. That was not considered controversial at all to say any of those things. And I think it was because from the point of view of the 1950s, after World War II, I think there was a real sense that we had moved past that, oh, that's how America was back then. But thank God, we're better now. And, we've gone through the New Deal, and we've gone through World War II, and we're a more liberal society. We're a more equitable society. There was, the country was more economically equal coming out of World War II than it was, for decades prior to that. But since the 1980s, where we've now once again sort of like reached, literally like Gilded Age levels of inequality, it seems that there's much less talk about that, right? It seems that people, most people probably don't know a lot about that era of history, other than maybe the barest outline of it. And I think, again, that's sort of, related to the de-emphasis on history in school and things like that. But it's also probably because yeah, because many of the themes of Gilded Age history seem very much to resonate with our current day era. The vast level of inequality, the vast level of corruption, the complete, subordination and helplessness of political figures to the corporate elite. All those things seem to very much resonate with that period of time. Now, that being said, I know I've heard that HBO apparently is going to be doing a TV series on the Gilded Age. I wonder how that will be. I'm not expecting much, to be honest. I don't even know if I'll watch it. HBO does do occasionally good things, though. They did make that show Succession, which I actually think is a really good show about the media, about this just pretty like awful family that runs this big media empire and things like that. So I don't know. So I don't know how it'll turn out. But even the fact that they're making a series about it now, kind of, I think it itself is speaks to the fact that obviously at least some people see that there is a kind of resonance between the era of the Gilded Age and the era that we live in now. Again, particularly in just the grotesque levels of inequality and the total ruthlessness of the corporate elite and the complete corruption basically of the political establishment in this country and their utter inability to deal with this corporate elite, other than to support them. So those would be at least a couple of examples of past historical periods. And again, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or any other revolution for that matter. I don't think people should just look at those things as these sort of archaic things that happened long ago that are completely foreign to our modern world. There is a sort of similarity between these things. All right, so let me turn to the text now. So again, the last thing that Benjamin wrote basically before his death. Again, so a lot of them are kind of ambiguous. So I'll try to interpret them as best I can. So basically starting with number one, the story is told of an automaton constructed in such a way that it could play a winning game of chess, answering each move of an opponent with a counter move. A puppet in Turkish attire and with a hookah in its mouth sat before a chessboard placed on a large table. A system of mirrors created the illusion that this table was transparent from all sides. Actually, a little hunchback who was an expert chess player sat inside and guided the puppet's hand by means of strings. One can imagine a philosophical counterpart to this device. The puppet called historical materialism is to win all the time. It can easily be a match for anyone if it enlists the services of theology, which today, as we know, is wizened and has to keep out of sight. So right out of the gate, very ambiguous. What exactly is he talking about here? What exactly is he saying here? So I have an image of what he's talking about. Let me switch over to that, of this puppet that he's talking about. So this is something of what it would have looked like. So you have this puppet playing chess. The illusion is created that, again, the puppet is playing chess, of course, but what's actually going on is that there's a little, what he calls hunchback, or a dwarf, basically, hidden inside this compartment here, which you can see is opened up, which would, of course, normally be closed. And that the hunchback, as he calls it, is manipulating the puppets, to move about in a certain way. And apparently he's also an expert chess player. And then he compares this to historical materialism, although he puts it in quotes, which is easy to miss, but I think has some significance to it as well. So what is he talking about here? It's a very vague thing. And again, right out of the gate, it's very vague and ambiguous what he is saying here. All right, so basically what I think it means, at least, is that he is saying that historical materialism, which he puts in quotes. So what I think that means is he's basically talking about sort of like a fake version of historical materialism, which could be social democracy in Germany, the sort of establishment socialist party. It could be the Soviet Union. Sort of uses historical materialism to sort of masquerade as a science, while really the person inside, the human element, the irrational element, is sort of what's really pulling the strings, which is what what he says, basically. So that it's sort of this sort of irrational thing, which is sort of masquerading or pretending to be rational and pretending to be scientific. Now, some people, and again, Scholem, for example, is one of the people that says that cites this as evidence that this marks Benjamin's break from Marxism. Many people, of course, do in fact say that, right? Many people do in fact say that Marxism is a religion basically pretending to be a science. So if you've ever heard that before, that might at least help understanding what they are talking about here. But the fact that he puts historical materialism in quotes, I think, to me at least, suggests that what he's talking about is sort of like the fake version of historical materialism. And I think that is supported by simply just reading the rest of the text. And obviously Benjamin's very much concerned with historical materialism and compares it favorably in many places to what he calls historicism, which again, historicism, like I've said, is basically sort of like the mainstream approach to history. Now, I think it is a fairly brilliant metaphor because it kind of conveys what it feels like to basically argue with somebody that's completely dogmatic, right? That they have their what they claim to be our scientific views that you can't argue with, right? Because there is a chess game, so there is the element of a competition here, engaging in a debate with somebody else, and the puppet doesn't lose, but it's also kind of an illusion at the same time. And they, if you've ever argued with somebody that's very dogmatic, and of course, the Soviet Union would be a good example of this, right? You can't get them to admit that they're wrong. You can't get them to acknowledge that, maybe something that they're doing isn't as rational as they may think it is, or it's not as scientific as they may think it is. And so this idea of, having this sort of appearance of being mechanical and scientific, sort of concealing the underlying irrationality of things, to me at least, is at least one way of sort of expressing this. And like I said, it's kind of a metaphor for what it's like to argue with somebody that's totally dogmatic. And of course, dogmatic people, it is hard to beat them in argument. Beat them in the sense of getting them to, change their mind or to, acknowledge that they're wrong, because dogmas sort of have these built-in ways of sort of like twisting everything around so that no matter what you say, they have some way of kind of like twisting it around so that they still come out being right, or at least think that they're right. And you don't necessarily have to stop at the Soviet Union either. I would say that this, a similar metaphor could be applied to dealing with a religiously dogmatic person, or again, in the contemporary United States, as I tend to, illustrate things in reference to the pandemic, the idea of, arguing with the Biden administration that they're not actually following the science or something like that. That they claim that everything that they do is based on science, yet any scientific objections to that are kind of, bulldozed out, sort of pushed to the sides and suppressed, including, dozens of doctors and, possibly more, as well as the fact, more people died in 2021 than died in 2020. More people died under the Biden administration than under Trump, yet they act like they have this thing under control and that it's contained and all that stuff. But you can't argue with them, right? And if you do, then they tell you that you're not following the science. So this idea of, again, sort of concealing the irrational aspect of things, which is symbolically represented by the hunchback here, with this illusion of scientific, mechanical, inflexible logic, which is represented by the puppet. I hope that's clear. Again, so he starts off very, very vague right from the outset, but I think it actually is a kind of interesting metaphor if you follow it like that. All right, so let me move through this pretty quickly. Maybe I won't read all of them. I'll try to read as many as I can. So he goes on. Number 2. So, you see each one's fairly short. Each one's basically like a paragraph long. One of the most remarkable characteristics of human nature, writes Lotz. Lotz was a famous German philosopher from the late 19th century, is alongside so much selfishness in specific instances, the freedom from envy which the present displays toward the future. Reflection shows us that our image of happiness is thoroughly colored by the time to which the course of our own existence has assigned us. The kind of happiness that could arouse envy in us exists only in the air we have breathed, among people we could have talked to, women who could have given themselves to us. In other words, our image of happiness is indissolubly bound up with the image of redemption. The same applies to our view of the past, which is the concern of history. The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. There is a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. This claim cannot be settled cheaply. Historical materialists are aware of that. So when he refers to a secret agreement between past generations and the present one, for example, I take that to be an illustration of this idea that, again, we are connected to the past. We are not detached from or disconnected from them. So Jocelyn asks, in paragraph 11, Benjamin is talking about the exploitation of nature. Yes, a very important theme. Is nature representative of human nature or as earth in this context, and how does nature play into the exploitation of man? Oh, that's a very good question. So I think what he's saying is that he's talking about, yes, like the natural environment, but of course people also are part of the natural environment as well. So we often have this sort of false dualistic idea that somehow human beings stand apart from nature. Well, how? What are we, like angels or something like that? I mean, we are a part of nature as much as anything else. So yes, what I think he's saying is that he's talking about, you know, the natural environment around us as well as people as well. And this, yes, this idea of the exploitation of nature, something which he sees, you know, among socialists as well, which, you know, in the Soviet Union and elsewhere as well, it is a very big theme, and certainly a theme that comes up in Horkheimer and Adorno as well. So that's good to bring that up, but we'll definitely talk about that more. But yes, I mean, I would say basically he's saying that it's both. It's both human beings as well as a natural environment around us. So again, we are connected to the past. And again, he's taking a view of the past that, you know, just because you look to the past doesn't mean that you're a conservative person. Doesn't mean you're saying, I mean, certainly he's not taking the view of, oh, look how great it was back then. Too bad we couldn't be like that now, which is pretty much the conservative mentality in a nutshell. He's certainly not taking that view, but he's just saying that, you know, the struggles that people dealt with in the past, we are still dealing with that. We haven't really moved on. You know, we're still pretty much dealing with the same kinds of things. And whether you agree with that or not, you know, is you know, another story. I mean, you can certainly debate that. He certainly felt that way. And, you know, again, I think it would be hard to argue against him, you know, writing in the context in which he is writing it. So this idea of a weak messianic power is interesting as well. And again, another religious reference. So I don't think it's the same as what he talks about here. The idea that the puppet representing historical materialism in quotes and the hunchback representing theology, because he's talking here about a weak power, right? This image of this big mechanical puppet doesn't convey a sense of weakness, right? It conveys, again, as what I would consider at least to be, you know, what would be considered dogma, this kind of false, which is almost like saying like a falsely confident view. You think you have everything figured out, you have all the answers, and no one can question your beliefs. That doesn't seem to be conveyed by what he says here. He talks about a weak messianic power. And it's this idea of, you know, almost like trying to save the past. The idea that, you know, Marxism tends to be a very sort of future-oriented theory, right? It tends to look towards the future more. Benjamin's saying that we should also look back to the past as well. That in fact, that we are, by trying to solve these problems which have been plaguing society for thousands of years, that we are in fact, if we ever do find a way to, you know, solve these issues, that we are in fact redeeming the past, that all the people that sort of, you know, struggled and suffered before us, that at least it sort of culminated in something. It doesn't obviously erase the fact of what these people have gone through, but at least it at least suggests that, eventually people were able to figure out, kind of solution to these things. And I think that's what he means by kind of redeeming the past. The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. So again, I think very much in that theme of stressing stressing the connection between the past and present. All right, so let me move on. A chronicler who recites events without distinguishing between major and minor ones acts in accordance with the following truth: nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. To be sure, a redeemed mankind receives the fullness of its past, which is to say, only for a redeemed mankind has his past become citable in all its moments. Each moment it has lived becomes a citation à l'ordre du jour, meaning, the order of the day. And that day is Judgment Day. So again, I think, very similar to the previous one. So I'll just move on to that. So a lot of these have, quotes from other thinkers as well. So here's one from Hegel, who I mentioned before. Seek for food and clothing first, then the kingdom of God shall be added unto you. Benjamin writes, the class struggle, which is always present to historian influenced by Marx. So again, he's breaking away from Marx. It doesn't sound like it when you read things like this. To a historian influenced by Marx is a fight for the crude and material things without which no refined and spiritual things could exist. Very important point, right? Before the sort of basic struggle over food and shelter, what he's calling here the crude and material things, has to be secured first before you can sort of move on to the so-called higher needs. And there's even a so-called hierarchy of needs, right, which was created by the psychologist Abraham Maslow in the 1940s. And that kind of, reflects that idea as well. I mean, many psychologists talk about that, to this very day, this so-called hierarchy of needs. Of course, you have to fill the basic needs first before you can move on to the higher needs. But once you fill the basic needs, then you do have to move on to those higher needs, the so-called refined and spiritual needs, as he says. Nevertheless, it is not in the form of the spoils which fall to the victor that the latter makes their presence felt in the class struggle, meaning, the so-called spiritual things. They manifest themselves in this struggle as courage, humor, cunning, and fortitude. They have retroactive force and will constantly call in question every victory, past and present, of the rulers. As flowers turn toward the sun by dint of a secret heliotropism, the past strives to turn toward that sun which is rising in the sky of history. Historical materials must be aware of this most inconspicuous of all transformations. So what I think he's saying here is that basically the spiritual aspects of life, besides just the material aspects of life, manifest themselves, particularly among the lower classes, as he says, courage, humor, cunning, kind of like what we'd call these sort of like plucky underdog qualities, right? We think of the underdog sort of, fighting against the man or whatever, who, is able to maintain a certain kind of hope and optimism, a kind of, toughness, but not bitterness in the face of all the struggle and things like that. I think those are the kind of qualities that he's talking about here. And he's saying that these are, qualities that have always been shown by the underclass, or at least by the best members of the lower class, and sort of, speaks to their, inner worth and complexity as human beings, right? That we're not just, creatures that just, eat and have only material needs, right? Of course, and we have spiritual needs as well, and this is how they manifest themselves. The true picture of the past flits by. The past can be seized only as an image which flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized as never seen again. The truth will not run away from us. In the historical outlook of historicism, these words of Gottfried Keller mark the exact point where historical materialism cuts through historicism. So again, very clearly the theme of historical materialism, Benjamin's view versus historicism, what I'm calling here basically mainstream history, what he's sort of struggling against. The truth will not run away from us, meaning that, the truth of these moments, of these, past moments, still, again, resonate, that we still have a connection to and attachment to these things today. We don't have to look that hard for them. They're not going to run away from us, meaning that we can understand what people were going through back then, because we're still going through these things now. For every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns threatens to disappear irretrievably. The good tidings which the historian of the past brings with throbbing heart may be lost and avoid the very moment he opens his mouth. So again, the idea that we, particularly during times of trouble, like say World War II, that we also tend to look towards other periods of conflict, right? And sort of see some connection between those things. All right, so like I said, I mean, common themes that are illustrated throughout. So let me move on then to the next one. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was, which again is kind of the view that he's going against here. It's not just recording facts. It's not just, you know, recording dates and things like that, but it's really understanding the real meaning, the real significance of what happened in the past. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. A moment of danger, like saying when you're, you know, fleeing for your life from the Nazis. Historical materialism wishes to retain that image of the past, which unexpectedly appears to man singled out by history at a moment of danger. So here again, like I said, even just a couple pages in, I don't really see how you can read this and interpret that he's abandoning or breaking away from historical materialism. It seems like he's trying to reformulate it, maybe to refine it in a way, but I don't follow that reading at all, that he's like leaving, you know, that he's leaving this behind, that he's in fact becoming a religious thinker, which is what Scholem says about him. The danger affects both the content of the tradition and its receivers. The same threat hangs over both, that of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. In every era, the attempt must be made anew to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. The Messiah comes, so again, another religious reference, not only as the Redeemer, he comes as the subduer of Antichrist. Only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. So this is kind of like that well-known saying, you know, history is written by the winners, right? The victorious power, the conquering army, they're the ones that then get to write the history of what happened, you know, leading up to this war. And of course, their take on things is you know, going to, you know, tend to win out. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, the cliches about history, which are, you know, cliches, obviously, but some of them, of course, you know, have some truth to them. Another very well-known one, of course, is he who forgets the past is doomed to repeat it. Very much a cliche, but it does have an important truth to it. And I think also kind of, you know, speaks to what Benjamin is talking about. And I think, you know, to take a critical view of society in the present, I mean, isn't that where kind of where a lot of people are? I mean, how many people walking around today really have any real significant knowledge of what happened in the past? I mean, they very much are detached from things that happened before. And I think there is that sense that, yeah, we're kind of just going through the same things over and over again. We haven't learned to, you know, trace our steps and figure out the way out of the labyrinth of history. And so we're doomed to keep, you know, wandering down these endless, you know, this seemingly endless maze. Okay, so even the dead will not be safe if the enemy wins, and the enemy has been winning basically. Consider the darkness and the great cold in this vale, which resounds with misery. This is from Brecht, from the Threepenny Opera. Bertolt Brecht was a very important German playwright, you know, radical, friend of Benjamin. Anyway, so to historians who wish to relieve an era, Fustel de Coulanges recommends that they blot out everything they know about the later course of history. There is no better way of characterizing the method with which historical materialism has broken. So again, I actually, you know, referenced this earlier on, right? This seems to be something that Benjamin is very much opposed to. This idea that you should just look at history in its own terms. Don't even think about what happened afterwards. First of all, how can you really do that? Secondly, even if you could, why would you want to? It just serves to create this sort of isolated view of how we look at things. So if you remember when we were talking about Lukács, Lukács who was a thinker that had an influence on Benjamin. Lukács talks about that, the sort of isolated view of facts versus looking at society in its totality, right? Looking at society as a whole rather than just looking at one isolated segment of it. That kind of has its parallel here, which is that rather than looking at one historical moment or one historical period in an isolated way, we should look at it in a context, in a sort of greater sense of connectedness. But that connectedness also does not mean that we look at it in a linear way as well. We don't just look at it, well, things were shitty back then, and then they got a lot better as we went on. No, it's a connectedness, but in the sense that we're pretty much where we were back then. That there hasn't really been that much progress, that we're pretty much dealing with a lot of the same issues, which are, again, are the big issues: oppression, inequality, injustice. These things haven't gone away, right? That we're still dealing with these same issues. So that would be his way of saying that, no, don't just blot out the latter course of history, that we should see the connectivity of all of history. Anyway, I'll skip ahead a little bit because this one is a little bit longer, but there is a very famous passage towards the end. So he says here, historical materialists know what that means. Basically that pretty much what I just said. Whoever has emerged victorious participates to this day in the triumphal procession in which the present rulers step over those who are lying prostrate. According to traditional practice, the spoils are carried along in the procession. They are called cultural treasures, and historical materials views them with cautious detachment. For without exception, the cultural treasures he surveyed have an origin which he cannot contemplate without horror. They owe their existence not only to the efforts of the great minds and talents who have created them, but also to the anonymous toil of their contemporaries. So the next passage is a very famous part. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just so much a document is not free of barbarism also taints the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another. Historical materials therefore disassociates himself from it as far as possible. He regards it as his task to brush history against the grain, meaning to sort of go against the conventional narrative of history, the conventional way in which we talk about history. I mean, many people have talked about American history in that way, or that our conventional view of American history is almost like, according to one person, like a Disney movie or something like that, right? Yes, there's conflict. Yes, there's struggle. Bambi's mother gets killed. Ariel loses her voice. Whatever it is, the house in Encanto, blows up or whatever happens to it. But things always work out for the best at the end. That's kind of how we view American history, right? That of course, there are bad things that happen along the way. There's conflict along the way, but good always triumphs over evil, and all that stuff. That's what Benjamin means about brushing history against the grain, that you have to fight against those conventional narratives. That being said, America being the dominant power in the world, of course, a lot of world history too is sort of written from a very pro-American perspective, right? We still tend to think of ourselves as the good guys, that we're the good empire, as opposed to all the other, bad empires that existed before us, that we're out there, spreading freedom and human rights and all that stuff. That we won World War II. Not that we didn't, not that the Germans weren't defeated during World War II, but who was it actually did most of the work in beating the Germans? It wasn't America. It was the Soviet Union. And that is something that can be verified by the facts. I mean, you just look at the number of people that fought. I mean, the Soviet Union lost, I think over like 20 million people during the war, close to 30 million maybe. America's lost about, 500,000. A lot, obviously. I think like 80% of German casualties were basically inflicted by the Soviet Union during the war. The Soviet Union really did the hard work and the toil and sacrifice of beating the Germans during World War II. And then we basically take all the credit for it, right? We say that we did it. Oh, we did it on D-Day. That was the turning moment of the war, compliments of Steven Spielberg and, Saving Private Ryan and things like that. And very few people question that. Very few people are even aware of the role that the Soviet Union played in that war. And the other idea, the idea that there is no document of civilization, which is at the same time a document of barbarism. Well, again, look at our society, look at any other society. The cultured aspects, the developed aspects of our culture or civilization or whatever you want to call it, is only exists because of the massive amounts of violence that we inflicted upon other people, whether it's Native Americans, slaves, foreign countries, which we've exploited and bombed, quite heavily. So all civilization is sort of paid for with barbarism. All civilization is only possible through barbarism, meaning basically violence, bloodshed, war, things like that. That's why it's a famous phrase there. All right. So this is an interesting one in that he talks about, I'll kind of skip over this one because as usual, I'm starting to run out of time here, but talks about, how people are basically sort of, passive towards fascism, that they don't really take it seriously. The people are amazed that things like this, I'm referencing another one. This one basically talks about how people are still amazed that things like this still go on now. How is it still possible in the 20th century? How is all this violence possible? Benjamin's basically saying, well, you shouldn't be surprised. Shouldn't be surprised at all. Again, because not much has really changed throughout history. So this is where he quotes Scholem. The first of the, all right, so this is 9. This is one of the more well-known ones as well. So here first of the Paul Klee painting, Angelus Novus, meaning new angel. So let me switch over because I did, of course, pull the image. It's on the slideshow. So this is the painting that he's talking about, just so you know. Now, when I first read this, I didn't, I didn't know what this painting looked like. So I read this passage first, and I thought, okay, that's interesting. And then I saw this painting after the fact. To be honest, I mean, if I saw this painting first, I'm not sure I would have come up with the same interpretation that Benjamin has. So let's see what he says about it. But I guess that's why Benjamin's a brilliant thinker. But that's it. So a clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking at as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. All right, I skipped over this Scholem quote, but all right, there it is there, translated. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. So again, metaphorical language, obviously, but the meaning of it, I think, is a little clearer to discern. And again, I don't see how you could read this and not think that he's being critical of the idea of progress throughout history, the idea that things are actually getting better. Also, this idea, this statement suggests what I've been saying also, that we can't look at history as these sort of isolated, detached periods that happen before us, where we perceive a chain of events, meaning like cause and effect, one period to another. The Renaissance led to the Enlightenment led to the, American and French revolutions, and so on and so forth. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. So there's a kind of sameness to history. Even our, like I said, and he does talk about this later on, so I'm kind of saving it for that, but who knows if I'll even get to it. But even, again, our very sense of time, the way we experience time, is it real? This the way we count and catalog, days, weeks, months, years, is that even real, or is that just a kind of artificial structure that we kind of impose on things? I'll try to say that for when he brings that up a little more explicitly. This was the thing I was talking about before. the sort of complacent idea that people have towards fascism, again, very much reminds me of contemporary Americans now, which is that, they don't take it seriously. The politicians' stubborn faith in progress, again, very much could be applied today. Their confidence in their mass basis, meaning that, oh, well, most Americans aren't like that. They're not going to stand for that. And finally, their servile integration in uncontrollable apparatus have been three aspects of the same thing, meaning, of course, that the capitalist politicians are incapable of really resisting fascism because they're subordinated to the capitalist system, and to deal with fascism would mean that you would have to deal with the underlying contradictions of capitalism that creates something like fascism in the first place. All right. So then he talks a lot about social democracy, doesn't really say anything about the Soviet Union or Stalinism, as it's often known as, but says a lot about social democrats, which would basically be sort of like the establishment socialist. In our country, these would be people like the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, even Bernie Sanders, you could say, the Squad, people who kind of mouth a kind of socialist rhetoric, but are really, fundamentally a part of the establishment. They're not really doing anything to really significantly change things either. The conformism, which has been part and parcel of social democracy from the beginning, attaches not only to its political tactics, but to its economic views as well. It is one reason for its later breakdown. Nothing has corrupted the German working class so much as the notion that it is moving with the current. It regarded technological developments as the fall of the stream with which it thought it was moving. From there is but a step to the illusion that the factory work, which was supposed to tend toward technological progress, constituted a political achievement. Basically, what he's saying is that the German working class also falsely sort of bought into this view of progress, right? This idea, okay, well, things are getting a little bit better. We've had a couple little socialist reforms here and there. We're evolving into socialism. This is very much, something that split socialists in the latter part of the 19th century and 20th century, right? What is the proper approach to take? Do you take a revolutionary view? Do you try to actually overturn and overthrow the capitalist system and the state upon which it relies? Or do you propose a sort of slower piecemeal change? You make a little reform here, a little reform there, and you convince yourself that you're making progress and that things are gradually getting better. Obviously, Benjamin very much critical of those views. He quotes Marx, who kind of was able to suss that out very early on, going back to the 1870s, this kind of false, progressive view of things. Again, I'll move on a little bit here. So here, this is now essay 12 or paragraph 12, excuse me. We need history, but not the way a spoiled loafer in the garden of knowledge needs it. Nietzsche on the use and abuse of history. Not man or men, but the struggling oppressed class itself is the depository of historical knowledge. In Marx, it appears as the last enslaved class, as the avenger that completes the task of liberation in the names of generations of the downtrodden. This conviction, which had a brief resurgence in the Spartacist group, has always been objectionable to social democrats. So I won't read the rest, but the reference to the Spartacist group is very interesting because it was a group of people. The footnote, again, tells you here, Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, who were brutally murdered by German fascist militias or proto-fascist militias, whatever you want to call them, at the end of World War I. But the Spartacist group is named after the Roman slave Spartacus. And of course, that is relevant here because this is kind of what we're talking about. Spartacus was a slave who led an unsuccessful slave rebellion against the Romans. Why did they name themselves after that? Because they see themselves as more or less doing the same thing. We're still fighting, we're still fighting the Romans, basically. Not much has changed. Just the costumes change, basically, and the languages maybe. But the behavior is the same. That's essentially what they're saying here. Again, another passage is critical of the idea of progress. Again, I don't see how you could read this and not think that he's, critical of that idea. 14. All right. So now we're getting into some of the more crazy stuff about time. Of course, I only have like 4 minutes left, but Origin is the Goal by Karl Kraus, famous Austrian writer from this period of time. History is the subject of a structure whose site is not homogeneous empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now, which he calls Jetzeit in German. Thus, to Robespierre, ancient Rome was a past charged with the time of the now, which he blasted out of the continuum of history. The French Revolution viewed itself as Rome reincarnate. It evoked ancient Rome the way fashion evokes costumes of the past. Fashion has a flair for the topical, no matter where it stirs in the thickets of long ago. It is a tiger's leap into the past. This jump, however, takes place in an arena where the ruling class gives the command. The same leap in the open air of history is the dialectical one, which is how Marx understood the revolution. So this is the first of several references he makes to blasting out of the continuum of history, which again is kind of how you sort of overcome the sense of isolation of the past. Robespierre, one of the leaders of the French Revolution, saw that in the ancient Roman Republic before it became an empire. And again, it wasn't just something that you study as a relic of history, but something which had a contemporary significance. Just the way we could look at something like the French Revolution and see the contemporary significance of something like that. But this idea of time, and I don't think I'll have that much time to go, ironically, have that much time to go that much further with that. But let's talk about what he's saying here. And he talks about, is it the next one about how they were, shooting the clocks, during the revolution in 1830 and things like that. What is the significance of time? Is there a sort of metaphysical way of understanding time that is different from our kind of, conventional way of understanding time? Benjamin seems to suggest this, and he seems to suggest that, again, our way of quantifying time, literally, is a kind of artificial structure that's sort of imposed upon us. And that artificial structure itself, of course, serves the interest of capital as well. How is productivity measured, or the productivity of labor measured? By time, hours. Why do people get paid hourly wages? Why do people have, punching clocks? Maybe they don't have that anymore, but they did for many years. I've had jobs where we had to, punch in a clock and things like that. Why are, the workday such a regulated thing? Why does your boss get mad when you're not working constantly? Because what do people always say? Time is money. So there's a way of quantifying time, of reducing time to that kind of structure, is something that suits the interest of capital. Why do we have time zones? When do time zones come about? Basically around, I think, the 1870s or 1880s, but it very much coincides with the expansion of the world market, right? Because look, if you're a banker in London and you're doing business in Singapore or wherever, you need to know, how you can sort of coordinate your activities that way. So what Benjamin is suggesting here is that this very sort of linear, again, very linear structure of time is artificial. And he seems to be suggesting this idea that, they're, rather than thinking of it even in terms of past and present, maybe there's just like one eternal present moment that just keeps stretching on. Just because the sun goes up and goes down doesn't really mean anything is really happening. Maybe there's more of a cyclical notion of time, right? That we just experience the same thing over and over again, rather than this fact that we're actually like moving in a straight line towards something. All right, and of course, with that, I'm out of time, so there's not much else I can say about it. Very interesting reading, though. Does again speak to this idea that not only does capitalism affect us in an economic way, concentration of wealth and things like that, but it affects our experience of the world. We've already talked about this idea of how it degrades our senses, usually in response to stimuli, an overflow of stimuli and things like that. Now he's talking about how it imposes on us an artificial experience of time. I mean, just one last thing. How to expect, when you're enjoying yourself, time flies by, right? You're not as conscious of time. It's kind of a nice thing when you're not constantly even aware of the time. So this constant awareness that we have, where this imposition of an awareness of time, counting the seconds, counting the minutes and things like that, is very much an artificial thing, which kind of, again, sort of degrades our experiences of things. And I think it's an interesting idea. It is something that we'll also sort of pick up in the next reading, which we'll start going over on Thursday. All right. So, are there any questions for me about anything? Okay. All right. Well, then, take care, everyone, and have a good day. possibly the theory of relativity is a capitalist idea. Interesting. Certainly something we can talk about next class. Thanks for acknowledging the Soviet Union did the bulk of the work during the war. Okay, yeah, so I'll see you all on Thursday. And yeah, we can definitely talk about that again. Take care.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.